Hey guys, we are back. Welcome back to the What's Next podcast, coming to you from beautiful Monterey, California. I get a chance to, as a massage therapist here in Monterey, I get a chance to talk to the most amazing people, and today is also one of these. She's an expert in foreign affairs, police development, and counterterrorism in an international context. She served 20 years in the federal government, including the U.S. Department of State and the Department of Justice. During her tenure, she managed foreign assistance programs and small business overseas professionalized training for the U.S. funded advisors. Miss Allison Plotts. Hey, not a great intro, but this is a lot. Holy cow. So tell me a little bit about this. It says you were in Asia, Africa, Middle East, Liberia, the Lake Chad Basin. Wow, you've been around.
It's always funny to hear someone else say what you've done, because
Right.
It always sounds like it's so much more interesting than
Right.
maybe what you actually did.
Yeah,
When
yeah.
you're in it, you don't really think about it. But
Right.
it was a pretty cool time. I admit I really enjoyed the work, and I had a great time doing it.
Oh, I bet. So tell me a little about yourself. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in San Jose.
San Jose, not
California.
that far away, huh?
So not too far from here. Lived there until I got married.
I see.
So, pretty much stayed home. Didn't expect that I would end up doing all the things that I did, quite honestly.
Yeah.
I think I thought that I was going to be in San Jose. I would stay there, maybe work for some investigative
Sure.
organization. I did want to get involved in investigative work.
What put you into that place? Now, how did you get that interest? Did you go to college for counterintelligence? I don't know.
Right,
Probably
yeah.
not. But.
Do you go to school for that?
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
stuff?
right.
Yeah, I guess you can. I did not. I did not go to school for that. I studied psychology.
Oh, I see.
So
Sure.
actually got my bachelor's degree at San Jose State.
Sure, of course.
And after that, I thought I was going to work with children. So my plan was to be a clinical psychologist, but work with kids.
Right.
And I had that plan until I actually did some close work with kids and realized that
That's not for me.
that's not exactly what I thought it would be.
Sure.
So I found myself, this is my early 20s, kind of scrambling around thinking, okay, well, what the heck am I going to do with my life?
What's next? Just
Exactly.
like the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. And I had always had a real interest in criminal justice and things like true crime and, crime shows on television.
Oh, yeah.
My father actually was in law enforcement,
Okay.
so it's probably part of where that came from. And, I suddenly thought to myself, well, what are the things that I'm interested in? And one of the things that I had always been interested in was crime and justice.
Right.
So I saw this great television program. I know this is going to sound like I made the story up, but it's really true. I saw this fantastic miniseries on television called Drug Wars.
Okay.
And it was about the Kiki Camarena story. And Kiki Camarena was a DEA agent that worked in Mexico. And I think this was in the 80s, if I remember correctly. And he was tortured, murdered, along with his pilot. Mm-hmm. And they didn't find the body. There was this huge investigation that took place with both on the U.S. side and on the Mexico side. If you remember back, there was a time period where the borders were shut down. The U.S. government basically shut down the border with Mexico. And a lot of it had to do with this investigation that was taking place. And there was a lot of struggle between the two governments about what each wanted and what each wanted to get out of this kind of cooperation. And the DEA was frustrated as well because they weren't getting the kind of cooperation they needed, and they wanted to just go in there and figure it out on their own. And that was very difficult to do. So it was this huge investigation, a very serious case. And for some reason, that story just really resonated with me. And I found myself thinking, this really just made me so angry. The fact that a federal government employee who was just trying to do his job could end up the way that Kiki Camarena ended up. And I felt really strongly how I wanted to be involved in some sort of process where I could support the work of law enforcement. And that was kind of where it started for me. So I ended up going back to school and did some post-baccalaureate work on, I think I did some like studies on criminal psychology and studying of the criminal mind. And then there was a class I took about the drug laws, just, kind of general stuff to get an idea of the kind of work that you could get involved in that wasn't necessarily being a cop, because I knew I didn't want to do that, but I wanted to do something that was investigative or was somehow in support of the work that police and other federal and local law enforcement does.
Sure, and you had a background in criminal psychology. So that's interesting.
So that was kind of how it started, and then from that, I just started dreaming bigger. I realized that, if I'm going to do investigative work, how would I want to do this? First, I ended up having a job. I took a job with a private investigator in San Jose, in fact.
Oh, how fun.
And so that was kind of interesting to learn a little bit about the private investigative side of things.
Right.
And then my big dream was to work for the FBI, was to be an FBI agent. But life had a different plan for me.
As it always does, doesn't
it? Things kind of took me off in a different course. Sure. Number one, I didn't have a master's degree, so I needed a master's degree to do that kind of work. I got married and I was whisked off to foreign countries to do other work, and the FBI won't process your application while you're overseas. At least at that time, they wouldn't. So I had to wait until I came back to the United States and got my master's degree.
Get your master's, right.
And then by that time, when I graduated, I was too old.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I aged out. I like to say I aged out.
They're lost. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's how I feel too. But again, the way life works out and the way things work out, I ended up doing something else. It was still in support of law enforcement, but in a very different way. So I think I ended up in the right place, but I had a little bit of a crooked path to get there, let's say.
Right. So where did you end up? In criminal investigations or?
So I ended up at a bureau in the U.S. government.
Okay.
Specifically at the U.S. Department of State. It was called the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs Bureau.
I see.
And that was due to the fact that I actually had an internship at that bureau. Let me take a step back. When I came back from being overseas the first time, I was studying for my master's degree. And when I was back in the U.S. doing those studies, I wanted to actually do some internships too. I wanted to get involved in research or some kind of, intern at some kind of job somewhere that would give me some skills that would help me utilize the degree I was studying for, which was a Master's of Science in Justice, Law, and Society. So it was kind of like a policy study, policy studies. So, and I knew I wanted to work for the federal government at that point. I wasn't sure where, because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do the FBI work because I was too old. By the time I'd graduate, I'd be too old.
There's so many options too.
Yes.
You don't even know all the options going into it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I was in Washington, D.C. at this point.
Oh, nice.
And so I was in a great place to do this kind of, criminal justice policy or international affairs or whatever it was. So I was doing a search for internships, and one of the places that I applied was at the Department of State. And I had two choices. Basically, they tell you, choose two different bureaus or offices that you would be interested in working in. And my first choice, in fact, was the Office of Counterterrorism. And the second choice I had was the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. My second choice was the one that picked me. And so that's how I ended up. I did an internship in that bureau, at an office in that bureau. and loved it so much that when I graduated, I got back in touch and said, hey, look, I'm getting ready to finish my schooling. I'd really like to come back and work with you guys. And apparently I did a good enough job when I was an intern because they wanted me back. And that was how I started my civil service career.
Sounds like you ended up doing the counterterrorism also. You must have come back to that. Let me take back for a second because I've got a gap. Now you got whisked off overseas. Unpack that statement a little bit. You must have got married and
yes.
was he military or?
Well, so the story is the true story is.
Is there a fake story too?
No, I know, right? What's the fake?
Well,
there's
people.
The cover story
this is
and
the true story.
Just kidding. There's no cover story. When we got married, I got married, and I was still living in San Jose. So then we moved to Monterey. So that's kind of how we came to know this area.
I see.
To know the Monterey area. And while we were in Monterey, my husband was finishing up his education, his master's degree, at what at the time was Monterey Institute of International Studies. Now it's Middlebury Institute of International Studies.
And that's here in Monterey.
That's here in Monterey.
I see, okay.
And so we moved to Monterey while he finished up his schooling. Basically, one day he says to me, he took me to lunch. And in fact,
here
Duffy
it comes.
Hunters, a little plug for Duffy Hunters. Over there by DLI.
Yep.
Great place for burgers and lots of other stuff. Anyway, we went to lunch.
Making deals.
Yeah, making deals. That's right. We went to lunch, and he says to me, how would you feel about maybe living and working overseas for a while? And at the time, I was working, where was I? I think I was working at the DoubleTree Hotel.
Okay, sure.
So again, remember, this was between the time that I had my bachelor's degree.
Right.
But I have a break now between the time that I got my bachelor's degree and my master's degree. This is during that break.
You went out overseas and then you came back and you did your master's later.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is even before we went overseas. But, so I got the bachelor's degree, got married, moved to Monterey.
So what did he say to you in the restaurant?
So he says to me, how would you like to maybe, spend some time living and working overseas for a while? And I just kind of thought about it and said, yeah, okay, sure, why not?
Where overseas? That could be a whole gamut of different places.
Well, yes, exactly. And I had no idea where it would be, but why not? Because I was figuring at this time, I was hoping that I could do something within the federal government. I didn't know what at the time. And I was just working jobs, basically, just to, support us while he was finishing up his schooling.
Right.
So, what happened was during his time at Meese, he was with a group of friends, other classmates, and they were all going to take the Foreign Service exam. So, the Foreign Service are the diplomats that tend to work overseas. These are, members of the State Department that are appointed, basically like the, kind of the cream of the crop, they say, to represent the U.S. government overseas in international affairs. That's what the Foreign Service officers do. So he went with this group of his classmates to take this test. And he was just like, on a whim, he was like, yeah, sure, I'll tag along. Why not? Because he wasn't exactly sure what he was going to do with his international affairs degree at that point either. Yeah. So he goes and takes the test, and it ends up that he's the only one of that group of his classmates that passes the exam.
Oh, geez. And he was the one doing it on a whim.
Exactly. Again, he's just like, yeah,
Must
whatever.
Must be smarter than all you guys. Sorry.
Right?
And
so, he passes the test, and then, and that's the written test, right? So then there's an oral exam that you have to go through as well. So he was going to be called for the orals at some point. And this is when he had the lunch. We had the lunch, and he explained to me, yeah, this is what's going on. I'm going to be called, and I'll go and take this oral exam. And if I pass that, then they'll probably put me on a list. And the list is basically to take him to training, and they train him up, and then he goes overseas to operate as a Foreign Service officer, as a diplomat. So, okay, I have no idea what all this is. But sure enough, they did call him. He did go take the oral exams. We had to drive to San Francisco for him to do the oral exams.
Sure, right, yeah.
And that day, actually, after he did the oral exams, they came out from making their decisions, and they decided that they wanted to hire him.
Right there.
So yeah, right
Nice.
then and there.
Right.
So that was basically kind of the beginning of my international, I say career, because being married to a Foreign Service officer, you're kind of in the service as well. And that was how I took it, because I operated off of a diplomatic passport just like he did.
Did you?
I had certain protections being married to the Foreign Service officer and being part of the diplomatic community. And you're representing, the way I took it very seriously. I was there as well as a representative of the U.S. government,
exactly,
and
right.
therefore a representative of the people. The
Right,
people of
sure,
America.
right.
So I wanted to make sure that I did things, on the up and up.
American,
and I'm behaving myself,
Yeah.
and you're basically on 24/7. And there are things like receptions and things that take place. A lot of times the spouses will go and be part of the reception because you're part of that international community,
Sure.
that diplomatic community. So you're representing right along with your husband or wife.
You're his better half.
Yeah,
Can't go anywhere without you.
exactly. And then, of course, while I was overseas, I did work as well. I had jobs.
I was going
of
to
my
ask
own.
you that, right?
Yep, and that's kind of where I did the work with the small business. There was a small business that was operating within the embassy where we are at in Norway. So we had 2 overseas assignments. We were in Seoul, South Korea first, and that was 2 years there. And then we did 2 years in Oslo, Norway. And so while in Oslo, there was basically a small business that was being operated under the American, what was it called? It was the Embassy Association. That's what it was, the Embassy Association. And it was the business was in a bit of disarray, and they needed to kind of bring things in under compliance and under regulations, because anything operating out of the U.S. Embassy, of course, has to be, per certain regulations. So that was basically my job, was to kind of get things in order and help operate this small business. So that was one of the things that I did. I taught aerobics. I mean, I did a lot of different things that honestly I wouldn't have done if I hadn't been, I hadn't been overseas. I taught aerobics while I was overseas. I taught English to, Korean speakers. So that was while we were in Korea. And what else did I do? I worked at the embassy part-time. I had a couple of different jobs. One of them was editing English translations of Korean political and economic news. So I worked in a little trailer with a number of Korean translators. So these were, they were all men. There's like 3 men that were translating Korean language into English to basically provide this information to different businesses, U.S. businesses, and others that were interested in just knowing kind of what was going on in Korea at the time. And it was fascinating because, they're translating Korean into English, and then I'm taking the English and I'm, just making sure that it makes sense and, the sentence structure is correct. And they were excellent translators, and it was a pleasure to work with them because I learned a lot. I got to learn a lot about politics, about the economy, the situation, how things were done in Korea, and how different it was, how different business is done in Seoul and in Korea generally. And then, of course, in Norway, I did the aerobics training. I was really interested in fitness and aerobics at that time,
right.
so I
That's
got to
the place
do that.
for it, huh?
Yeah, it was great,
right.
wonderful, and very active. A lot of people are very active there. And I also worked in the embassy there. I worked for the political counselor, so in the political section of the embassy, I was like a secretary. They're called office management specialists within the at the embassy and within the Department of State. And it was like a temporary position. I was filling a gap. And because I was there and I had the qualifications, then I could do it basically on a contract.
Right.
So I did that for a short amount of time, and that helped me learn as well how the embassy operates and what it's like to work overseas and to work within the diplomatic community.
Yeah. You were talking about the Korean language. We've got the Navy, or I don't know if it's Navy, but it's the Navy, or I'm sorry, the Language Arts Center over
Oh, the
here.
Defense Language Institute.
Yeah. So I get to see people that are learning everything from Farsi to Korean to everything else. And what they say is you have to learn Korean, but then you have to learn a different kind of Korean when you're dealing with military and you're, for dignity, I'm sure, but the same type of thing. You have to know way more than just the basic Korean language. And they're tested on that. And wow, that must be really interesting because it's almost a whole different language.
Oh, it is.
I mean, a different language, obviously, but it's a whole different language from the basic street language of speaking in Korean.
And the written language is very different. It's Hangul, which is written very differently.
Oh, interesting.
They don't use the phonetic, they use a phonetic writing system, but it's not English. It's not like the same symbols. It's very different, but it's also phonetic. So you can read it and you can sound it out. Like I can read Hangul, but I can't tell you what it means.
Yeah, right.
I learned a little bit when I was there, and I learned a few phrases that I know. But if I see like a sign in Korean in Hangul, I can sound it out. Because it's a phonetic language, but I can't always tell you. I can't tell you what it means.
Right. Well, you would have if you stayed there long enough. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I learned a few phrases while I was there that I've probably forgotten now.
Sure.
Some things I still remember, but it was very interesting to because my husband too had studied Korean in the Army.
Oh, he did.
So he was able to give me a little bit of Korean language lessons, some Korean language lessons before we actually went to Seoul, and that was super helpful.
Yeah. Just the little stuff.
Yeah,
My best friend in high school was Korean. He came over from South Korea. And there was quite a language barrier there at first, But it was interesting at such a young age learning a different culture.
Yeah.
Coming straight from, I think he was from Seoul also. Yeah, something like that. But really interesting. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I love that. So there was what were you doing in Liberia?
Oh gosh, so that's a whole nother story. Yeah.
Now, are you training people to go over there and start businesses? I'm a little confused. What were you doing at that point? So you got your master's degree. You came back and you went to the Middlebury Institute. Is that where you got your master's?
No, we were overseas for 4 years, and at the end of the 4 years, we came back to the U.S. And my husband was still Foreign Service, so he was working at Maine State in Washington, D.C., and that's when I started going to school. So I knew I wanted to pursue a master's degree. So I had already been applying to schools while I was overseas in Norway, which was our last posting. And I was accepted to American University in Washington, D.C.
In Washington, D.C. Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, so it worked out very well.
Sure.
And great school, and that's where I started studying for my master's of science degree. And so did that, did the internship, as I mentioned earlier, the internship with the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs Bureau, then went to work for that bureau.
I want to hear more about that, too.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that one.
Yeah.
Circle back around.
During the time that while I was working in INL, I was working in an office that covered foreign assistance programs for police and criminal justice development. And that's where I started working on programs that were focused on criminal justice development on the continent of Africa.
Ooh.
And so that's how I ended up, I started working on Africa for that office. Kind of a funny story because, again, I had started as an intern in this office. And when I came on board as an intern, the supervisor that I was working with, he was the deputy director of the office that I was working for at the time. And he sat down with me and, I'm introducing myself and we're doing the whole courtesy call kind of thing. And he asked me, what I was interested in, and what I liked, what I was interested in doing in the office, and what I wanted to learn. And I said, well, I think I'm really interested in Asia, because at that time I had done a lot of study of my own on like the Japanese police. I had spent some time in places overseas, like in Thailand, and I hadn't been in Japan yet, but I'd spent some time in Asia because I had been in Korea.
Sure. Right.
So, Asia, 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 I kind of come in talking about it. And he just sort of listens to me very, very, very quietly, nodding his head. He says, yeah, you're going to work on Africa.
That's not even close to Asia.
And I just I just kind of said, okay, but I don't know anything about Africa. He goes, yeah, you're gonna learn. And sure enough, that is exactly what happened. So he was great with me. And he allowed me to work very independently, but because he had a gap in his office, he needed somebody to cover those specific programs, that portfolio, which was Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And he also knew that region, so he worked very closely with me to kind of teach me, what the important things were, what was the stuff I needed to know, how to do everything I needed to do in the office. And it was fascinating, and I really, really took to the work. I loved it, and I felt like when I worked in that office, and this is just as an intern, but I was covering a portfolio that was basically a portfolio managed by a senior foreign service officer at the time. And he trusted me to work with it. And I just felt like the working in that office and doing that work was such a great combination of all that I had studied and what I had learned from working and living overseas as well. So it was a great combination of international affairs. It was law enforcement focused. And it was supportive of not just international criminal justice, but it was supportive of U.S. criminal justice, because a lot of what the U.S. government does overseas with foreign police and other security forces overseas, we're helping develop these groups out overseas so that we can talk to each other. A lot of it has to do with information sharing, and just knowing how to speak the same language when it comes to things like investigations, to human rights issues, arrests, and running different cases and things overseas, working with foreign security forces. So like our police that go, or our FBI that go overseas and work with security forces, investigative groups in other countries. If we speak the same language and we understand each other, that's gonna be huge for us to work together and to cooperate and to be able to solve cases, hopefully help them solve their cases, but also have them help us solve our cases overseas.
Because they're on the same page as us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I had a Green Beret soldier on who grew up in Iran. He had gone into the military, the army in Iran, and was completely trained by Americans.
Oh, wow.
I think that's the same kind of thing. So we're all,
Yeah.
this was a long time ago.
Do you mean Iraq?
It was Iran, but it was way back in the early 70s.
Okay, yeah, it must have been a long time ago.
He's, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, he's up there. But yeah, that's when he was young, and then probably
Okay.
in the 60s even, maybe.
Okay, yeah.
Back when Iran was,
With the Shah,
beautiful
probably during
place.
the Shah was
yeah,
there.
exactly,
Yeah.
the Shah and all that. So, yeah, it was kind of neat how the Americans had trained their Green Berets, probably for the same reason, where they could work with each other and be on the same page.
Oh, yeah.
Must be the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's, very similar.
I had a guy come in not too long ago. He said he was a foreign dignitary. Is that the same thing as a foreign?
Yeah.
I don't even know what that means.
It depends on your, that's the sort of terminology I usually hear by, people from other countries. Like we would say in the U.S., we say diplomats.
I see.
A lot of folks in other countries might say dignitaries.
He was from Spain, so maybe it was something different.
Yes,
Right.
and it could have been, too, that he might have been, within his own government. He would have been a dignitary within his own government. So maybe he was, he could have been a minister of something.
I see.
Or assistant minister, deputy minister, something like that,
Right.
to within the host country's own government. Yeah.
So was there a specific type of law enforcement that you were working with, or just anything that involved America to Africa, or was there like a drug policy you were chasing? Was there what was the idea? Because
Yes.
the law in Africa, that could cover
Well,
millions
yeah,
of things,
we
right?
could talk. Yeah, we could have a whole show
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
about
right,
the way things are
exactly.
done in countries in Africa.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so it was specific. Usually, it was well, first of all, it would be countries on the continent that, because Africa, we say Africa, but when you refer to Africa, Africa's a continent.
Right,
Not
right.
a country. Africa, the continent, is made up of, I believe it's it might be 48 or 49 countries now that make up the continent of Africa. And each country does things very differently.
No kidding.
So, and each country has its own languages. Now a lot of them do speak English, but many speak, they may have French, they may speak Portuguese, Spanish, and then certainly there are local languages too, dialects and different languages from different ethnic groups that have been on the continent from before the time that the United States even existed. So there are a lot of, and every single country has these different cultural groups, different ethnic groups, and some of the countries have borders that actually separate the similar or the same ethnic groups. So you might have a village in one country of a particular ethnic group, and then you go across the border into another country, you have another village of that same ethnic group, because those borders were actually put on the continent by the colonialists.
Of course.
By, not so much the United States, but Great Britain, France, let's see, who else? Great Britain, France, I think, what are the other countries that have colonized?
Mostly British, I would imagine.
Yeah,
huh?
British, French. British and French were probably the two largest
Spain.
groups. There may have been some Spanish, but very little. And Portugal too was
right.
also very involved
Yeah,
in collecting colonies, let's say, at the time. Belgium certainly also had a stake. The Dutch as well. So there are a number of Western or outside groups or countries that came into the continent and worked with different states, we could say countries now, but different parts of the continent. And then eventually these borders were kind of put onto the continent by those colonists, not by the African nations themselves. And so now we find that does create a little bit of confusion when you have Western governments like our own going and trying to work with the different governments on the continent there, the different African nations, because their ideas of border and of border security and nationhood and nationalism, it's all very different, because they have a whole different history. I mean, they have a whole different history than us, than anybody else. I mean, it really is like that for every country. But I personally happen to think that Africa is a special case, because there are so many different types, so many different languages, people, cultures. It makes it a fascinating and wonderful place. But when you're trying to work with, work within politics or within economics, it really makes it very complicated, because these are very different systems than what the Western governments are used to.
Mm. It's funny. Of course, I went to public school, so I should probably know more than I do. I look at Africa as kind of like the United States as a country, but with the states in it. But as I guess I did know that it's a continent, and all these states are actually separate countries.
Yes.
In there.
Yeah.
I don't think about Africa too much, but yeah, that is the way it is. You know, I was watching something that a gal had she'd grown up in Africa and she'd done really well for herself, and she wanted to go back and help her village and help her country, and she said it was just so corrupt. She just, in America you could apply for a business license and get it within a week. There you had to, follow it up for a year and a half. And by the time you get to, all the rules have changed. You have to start over. So everything was just so corrupt between all the different, all the too many hands in the.
Yes.
I think is what it is.
I was going to say that too.
Did you run into that too?
Oh, yeah. Yes. And a lot of what the U.S. government was doing, the kind of work that we were trying to support on the continent at the time that I was doing that work was focused on anti-corruption.
I see. Okay.
And
that'd be the first thing you have to tackle.
Well,
sounds like.
So this is, and again, we could probably have a whole session about corruption and anti-corruption issues. But the thing about corruption is that certainly you have international standards for, levels of corruption and what is accepted, what isn't accepted. Every country has corruption. We have it here.
For sure.
We have it in the United States, big time.
I'm not lying to anybody.
Right? Every country has it, but what you have are certain degrees, right? There are certain degrees of corruption in every country. In Korea as well. And Korea is a good example for things like what is corruption versus what is the way that a country does business from a traditional level. And is it something that we just don't understand from a Western perspective, whereas this is something that maybe the Eastern perspective actually has no problem with. Same thing with Africa. I ran into that as well in certain African countries. What we in the United States might consider egregious corruption, if you talk to the African people in a particular country, would say to you, this is how we do things. We accept it. This is an acceptable level of what we have to do to get certain services. Now there's a certain level above that or beyond that everybody says, no, I shouldn't have to do this. But I think it's something to just take into consideration is that when we talk about corruption, you have to think it in terms of degrees of corruption and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And I personally prefer to look at it from the standpoint of the people within a country, not the government.
That's a total different thing.
Exactly, because the government's level of what they're willing to is very different because many governments again, I don't want to just pick on Africa, but that's what I know. So, because you see this all over the world, but within some of the countries that I worked, the level of corruption within the government was a huge problem for the people of that country.
Right.
And that's where we would want to say work with that government, try to help them understand how they can do things in a different way, to do it maybe less corruptly so that the people can get what they need. You struggle with it all the time. And Korea is a good example of a place where there are practices that we look at as corrupt. We think it's corruption, but yet to the Korean people, it's actually it's a way that service is done. This is something that let's see, when I was working with the translators, we used to talk about this, and there was a term, and I cannot remember now what the term was, but when a person gets a job and he's working for a boss, he has a supervisor or a boss, during certain times of the year, the employee is expected to give that boss money, a certain amount of money. That was like an honorarium or some sort of a gift. And now from an American Western perspective, I would look at that and go, but isn't that like a bribe, or
But
isn't
he's
that
making
corruption?
more than I am. Why should I pay
Why
him?
am I?
Right?
Yeah. Why is that
that would send an
employee?
American through the roof, wouldn't
Exactly. And I would ask my Korean translators about this, and they're like, no. That's not how we look at it. Honestly, it's just, this is just something that happens from, it's like a gift that you give to your boss because they are, because they're your boss. And, again, it's hard to understand it from a Western U.S. perspective. If you
Right.
didn't grow up in that system and you don't understand kind of the honorary aspect of that, show of respect.
Sure.
So it's, that's where I would always run into this issue of, well, okay, we call it corruption, but what do they say? And not what the government says, but what do the people of that country say? Liberia is another example. As you mentioned, you were asking me about what I was doing in Liberia, and I was working with the police in Liberia. And in Liberia, there is a tradition of police, which we would call them patrolmen, like patrol level police, that were doing traffic stops.
Sure.
And the police would pull cars over, and any time they wanted, and basically ask for what they called small, which was basically a bribe. It's like they would ask the driver for money. And the driver was supposed to pay this patrolman money, or they would, perhaps their car would be taken, or they might be arrested. So it's basically like bribe. It's like a bribery kind of a thing that we look at it as bribery. If you were to talk to some of the Liberians there, which I have done, and they would say to me, given this poor police officer, this poor patrolman that doesn't make enough money to even feed himself, let alone his family, if I, given him a couple of Liberian dollars, which in exchange was not worth a whole lot anyway, they're like, I don't have a problem with that. I'm okay with that because I'm helping this poor person who doesn't, and plus maybe I can afford to give him the money.
Sure.
And maybe he doesn't have to ask it from somebody else who
Right.
can't afford to give it.
He's doing a very important job too. If it'll fire him up to go.
Yeah, and it's kind of how some people would think of it. Now, others you talk to would say, I don't want to have to give them anything. Well, yeah, that's fair too. To not want to have to. Number one, shouldn't that patrolman be paid a living wage?
Exactly.
So those are the kinds of things that on a diplomatic side, you would work with that government to say, hey, can we figure out together how you, Liberian government, can pay your police, a living wage?
Living wage.
And would that help, say, kind of control the amount of bribe taking that might be going on?
Right. That's interesting. Everything's so different.
Yes.
You try not to hold things to an American standard. You have to kind of.
Exactly. Yeah,
Right.
You can't hold it to it. Yeah, that's where you get yourself into trouble. If you are trying to hold everyone else to an American standard.
Sure.
I mean, again, this is my own personal opinion.
Sure, yeah,
Number
yeah.
one, I don't work for the government anymore.
Right.
So I can say this,
Right.
and I can have a personal
My
opinion
opinion.
now. And from the years of work that I did and the time I spent overseas, one of the lessons I learned was that you cannot expect other countries to operate at the same level that the U.S. does. And sometimes I believe that you have to look at what a government is capable of doing in their own context and where they're coming from, and figure out how to work with them where they are and help them kind of do things the right way based on their own system, and not necessarily try to recreate a U.S. system in a country.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's necessary to do that in order for our governments to work together, in fact. I think we can, in fact, still come to a compromise.
Common ground.
Find common
Sure,
ground,
right.
but it doesn't mean that I have to recreate the U.S. political system or the
Sure.
U.S. economic system within that country.
Sure. I look at us as for the people, by the people. But there's
Yeah.
still corruption.
Yes, yes. Which kind of, it makes you wonder. I may be biased, but I still believe that we have the fairest justice system on the planet, and we have the best. We have the most democratic system on the planet as well. As much as much trouble and as many problems as we have, I still believe of those two things: the justice system and the democratic system that we have in this country are still the best in the world. And I've been all over the world now. You know, you can say whatever you like against the U.S. government, and then you should be thankful because you can do that.
Sure.
If you go to other countries, there are still countries in this planet where if you speak against the government, any kind of criticism against the government, you'll be disappeared off the street.
Really?
Or you may be murdered.
Right.
So there
Or
are
both.
places on this planet where you can't speak out.
Right.
And you don't have the right to criticize your government or your police force or your justice system. And in this country, we are able to do that. I mean, we see it happening all the time. We have the right and we have the ability to actually speak out against these things. I mean, that's also, I think, how change happens. You know, if you want to see change happen, then a lot of times it comes from protest or from at least speaking out against the things that you believe are unjust. Not in a violent manner. I don't believe in violence, but you know, certainly we have the right to speak out against that. And it's something, I think it's a right that we take for granted. Unfortunately, in this country, we often take many things for granted. And if you haven't spent time out of this country, if you haven't come from a foreign country, or if you haven't spent time traveling and seeing what happens to people in other countries who speak out against the government or who deal with police brutality, you have no idea. And we have it pretty damn good in the United States. Even still, with all the problems that we have, I would not want to live anywhere else but here, quite honestly, because I wouldn't trust any other, you know, living and doing the things that I want to do and being able to say what I want to say. I wouldn't trust that I could do that in any other country on the planet.
Right. I just had a fella come in 2 days ago, and he had just come back from India, and he had been teaching over there, and he said he couldn't believe the air quality difference. It's not just the government, but coming back to America, just I can breathe here. I can, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was said it was just absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
You know, just the particulates are so large there. It just makes it hard to breathe. And, you know, it's like, so, yeah.
That's right. Different
many,
regulations.
Many things.
Different regulations or no regulation.
Lack thereof,
you know,
right.
Yeah, because, and granted, a number of countries, this is one thing I'd run into as well when I was doing the work that I was doing on rule of law and criminal justice development. We would go into a country and we would want to talk about things like these high-level ideas and these ideals about rule of law, you know, and anti-corruption. It's like, well, you know what? When you're in a country where, again, people aren't getting paid a living wage and they're struggling just to feed themselves, let alone their families, and they have, you know, children and their wife and maybe multiple wives. In some countries, yes, men have more than one wife. You know, it's kind of hard to kind of make somebody think about these high level sort of, you know, out in the atmosphere kind of ideals when, you know, they don't have the things that they need to just survive. They don't have clean water. They don't have 24-hour power. You know, they don't know if they're going to be able to get enough gas to drive their car, and they've got to drive for miles in order to get to work. Maybe they can't go to work that day. Maybe they can't walk the distance. They don't have medical care. You know, so there's so many things that come into play there that it's hard to get someone to focus on those high-level ideals unless they're getting what they need, the basic necessities of life.
I love looking at history and different civilizations, and you can kind of see where they became comfortable, and then they could start working on other problems. Once they had their food covered, their water, all of the different things that they needed, they weren't scrounging. Once they had a city, then they could actually start thinking about philosophy, what's going to make things better for us. But as long as they're starving, they're not going to move forward.
Yeah.
Just like what you're saying, you know, if your whole day is consumed with how am I going to get 13 cents or how am I going to get, enough gas to, nothing else is getting done.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
number one is feed the children,
Yeah.
That's all that matters, really. Yeah.
Yeah, my oldest sister was a missionary.
Oh, really?
And and she, when I went to visit her, she had this great poster in her, she lived in an apartment, and she had this great poster on her wall, and it was basically about, she's Christian, and I'm Christian too, but she's,
Sure.
she was a Christian missionary, and so the poster was basically about Jesus and about Jesus feeding the 500 and, the loaves and the fishes. And it talked about the fact that, the first thing that Jesus did was he fed them. He fed people. And then he talked about the path to God. So that always made a huge impression on me.
That's huge.
The idea of, come to people where they are, give them what they need first, the most important things they need, the bare necessities, and then talk about some of these high ideals.
Right.
It's like that too in government work
Sure.
and foreign assistance. I think that makes really good sense. Yeah.
To a biblical proportion.
Yes.
Really.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
It's, when I was reading your bio, I said, or I read the counterterrorism type thing. In this country, basically, you hear a lot about with the open borders, and we're having a lot of people are worried about sleeper cells and in this country.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Is that something that you ever dealt with, or you're more dealing with overseas type things?
Well, yeah, the work that I was doing was focused overseas.
I see.
But it's not that different from domestic. The idea of
I see. Right.
the idea of how do we deal with terrorism in our own country? It's not that different from how we work with other governments to deal with terrorism in their own countries. I'll say this: we've always had terrorism. Terrorists have been on the soil in the United States ever since the country was created, even perhaps before that.
That's a great point.
So, the real issue is, well, are we just more aware of it now? I think perhaps we are much more aware of a lot of things that people get anxiety over because of social media. And because we have it's easier for us to get information. It's so much easier for us to get information. You and I both are of an age. We all remember what it was like before the internet.
Right.
When we didn't have the internet, we had, newspapers, actual paper newspapers to read that told us the news.
Index cards in the library.
Index cards in the library, exactly. Doing that search. I used to love that.
You remember that, don't you? Huh?
I used to love going through those index
over
cards.
There.
Yeah, exactly. And then we had we'd have the 11 o'clock news or the 6 o'clock news on television. And that's where we got our news and our information. What we saw on TV, what we read about in newspapers, what we read about in magazines. Now, the amount of information that is being channeled and passed around now is phenomenal compared to the way it used to be. There was a lot of the stuff that we're learning about now. I think it's just because we have access to the information. So a lot more people are learning about the things that have always been taking place. And I used to say that when I was working for the government, that part of my job was to take care of the things so the average American didn't have to worry about it. I had the clearance so that I could look at those things and see the things that are happening or about to happen, hopefully do something about it before it happens. And then the average person never even had to know that there was even an inkling of something going on out there.
Right.
It's the same way now. It's just that there's so much more information available and it's being passed around so much more quickly that people are inundated with this stuff. And I have a lot of people that I'm a writer, and so I'm a member of a lot of writing groups, and a lot of my friends in these writing groups, are some of the folks that will just they're on social media constantly. And that's how they get their news. And I try to explain to them, like, look, number one, you got to take a break. You can't just continuously watch this stuff because it'll drive you nuts.
The term drinking from a fire hose comes to mind, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And there's so much coming at you, and they're trying their best to be memorable.
Yes.
So they may put a little bit of BS.
Oh, a spin.
Or a little clickbait or whatever to get you
Absolutely.
in there, too. So,
Yeah.
watch what you read.
That's right.
Everybody's trying to get read.
Yep, it's all about the spin, and just because it's on the internet
spin,
doesn't make it
right.
true. I mean, there's
It
a
may
lot of crap
lend
on
itself
there.
to true, but
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of crap out there, and again, when I did this kind of work, I mean, I was having to deal with a lot of very stressful situations. I couldn't watch the news and pay attention 24/7.
No,
there was no
it's
way
too
on
much.
earth, because it would have driven me nuts. I would have
Right.
had to leave the government way earlier than I did.
Sure, right.
And I wouldn't have been effective at my job.
Right.
So, for the average person, I mean, to me, it doesn't make any sense that you would just inundate yourself with this kind of information constantly, because
Right.
number one, there's not a lot you can do about it.
Yeah.
Even if you're in the business, there's
Right,
not always
right,
a lot you can do
right.
about it. So you have to prioritize, and you have to temper what you pay attention to. Anybody should be doing
I was
that.
just going to say, that's a great policy for life.
Yes, right?
Watch what you're putting into the old sponge.
Yeah. Focus on the things that are most important, right?
Exactly.
Now, like for me, for example, I don't pay as much attention to international news as I used to, because I had to do it for my job.
Sure.
When I moved out here, a lot of my plan was to try to get as far away from that as I could. Anything going on with Washington, D.C. politics, I tend to avoid. I pay just enough attention to kind of know what's going on, but not enough to make me crazy, because, again, I'm far removed. I can't do anything about it. And I pay much more attention to local news now, local politics, local news, what's going on in my community. I figure that's where I can be more effective,
Right.
because I'm here.
Sure.
And this is the place where I can hopefully make some kind of a difference.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to affect things in Washington, D.C. I'm not going to be able to affect things overseas. I don't do that kind of work anymore.
Somebody said, my give a crap circumference just keeps getting smaller as I
Yeah.
get older. I totally relate with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and life is short.
Exactly.
And what do you want to spend your time on?
Things that you
know?
can do something about, or things that are just going to drive you crazy.
That's right. And what's going to give you joy? What's going to give others joy?
Right.
And that to me is what's very important. That's really what's important in life.
Funny side story. The last time I was in Washington, D.C., we took I think it was an 8th grade field trip. We were walking down the street going to the next museum, and every siren in the city went off.
Ooh.
Whether it was, and we were like, what in the heck is going on? Turns out Reagan got shot just right around the corner. Was that 1980?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the last time I was in D.C. I guess I've driven through there, but I was right there.
Wow.
Anyways,
Yeah.
So tell me about your writing. You said you were writing, and of course you lent to maybe some spy stuff, that you were interested in different things. And when you were younger, did you ever do some writing with criminal type things? Did you bring that in?
Well, first of all, I did a lot of writing, tons of writing.
Like
while I was working.
international stuff, or like?
Yeah, I mean, I've done, just like work-wise, I had to do a lot of writing while I was
see.
working.
Right.
And any writing is practice.
Sure.
I'll say that for the writers that might be listening. It doesn't really matter what kind of writing you're doing. It's all practice. And so the writing that I was doing on a professional basis was, writing for the government. But it helped me immensely when I left the government and I started working first on my own. I was running a small business for a little while, self-employed, and doing consulting work. And then now, even just as I'm writing fiction, it's hugely helpful.
This was the consulting business that you were helping people that went overseas with businesses, or what was that all about?
Different? Oh, yeah, it was a little bit different.
Okay.
So when I left federal government work in 2017, and we moved back to California, I actually started a small business, a small consulting business.
Doing what?
Doing like consulting on foreign affairs. So similar work to what I was doing for the government, but doing it out on a private basis.
Give me an example. What do you mean?
Well, let's see.
Foreign affairs. That's a huge.
Yes. So one of the things that I did while I was working for the government was to help train foreign police on things like, human rights issues, communication, leadership, anti-corruption.
So when you took
basic
that into the
investigative
small
type work.
business,
Yes.
you did that for small organizations or small business?
Yes, actually, I had a contract that was with the U.S. government.
Okay.
So it was similar work for on a private basis as a private citizen.
Sure.
As a contractor
Right.
that I did when I was working in the government. Now, granted, when I was working for the government, I was an official representative of the U.S. government, and most of my work was managing contracts, managing the programs that were being implemented by other individuals. So that's where the training of experts comes in. So, for example, if we were working with a foreign government that wanted to train its police, its national police force, how to run its own training academy, then my job in my portfolio was to work with those U.S. experts. So we might get a former police officer that worked at a training academy as a supervisor of training, something like that. And I'm just pulling stuff out of the air here. But so I would then I was part of the cadre that would help train that former police officer, U.S. police officer, that we were going to send overseas.
Be able to go overseas and train them. Okay.
Yes. So training of those trainers.
I see.
And so when I left government, I started my small business, and I was working as a contractor, on a contractual basis.
Contracted by the government.
By the government.
Right.
To also go to other countries and help train their police. So actually that work, in fact, I did not for the U.S. government, but I actually did it on a contract for the UK, so the United Kingdom. But for the U.S. government, this is very complicated. I apologize.
That's why we got you here, to break it all down, because we're clueless.
So for the U.S. government, I had worked as a policy, like a policy advisor on a program that was set up to help train police and military in foreign governments together on border control issues. So when I left government and I became I worked on a contract, I actually ended up going overseas to work on that same program, but now I was the subject matter expert, and I was actually doing the training. I was actually working with police and military together in this was in the Lake Chad Basin. This was part of that Lake Chad Basin work that I was doing. And I was able to help them to brainstorm, to work together, I facilitated discussions between the two sides, the police and the military sides, to try to figure out how they were going to cooperate on policing their own borders, on doing their own border control. So I did that as a contractor. As a contractor, yeah.
Under the umbrella of the government, basically, but contracted out.
Yes, right. Yeah. And that was, of course, as a self-employed with a small consulting company that I created. I mean, I call it company, but it was me, basically.
LLC, right?
It was just me and a laptop.
My vast,
basically, my vast empire. Yeah, in my house at my desk with my laptop, and basically because I had done similar work for the government. and I knew the people that were involved in that program, and because I had that knowledge, they wanted me to stay on and to actually help work things and implement them in the field, basically on the ground. And that was something that I'd always wanted to do, quite frankly. And one of the reasons that I felt comfortable enough to leave the government work was because I felt like I was at a point where I could be the implementer. I could be, instead of me being the one that was like managing the implementers, I could be the implementer because I had done that work.
Confidence must have been way up there.
Oh, yeah.
Right on. You went out and started your own business or LLC, whatever.
Yeah.
And went after it.
Yeah. So
That's
now, of
cool.
course, now this takes me back to what the original question was.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the original question was.
That's the way we are here. I don't know. We have no agenda here. So I pulled you off of the talking about writing. So
about writing.
Now
yes,
you've got writing classes, writing what clubs, I guess, as we were saying.
Yeah. So now
tell me about that.
Yeah. So a lot of writing groups basically.
Right.
So these are just groups that other writers get together, and either you're talking about writing, or we're writing together. We're
bouncing off ideas,
brainstorming, critiquing each other's work.
Oh, right.
So there's a few different ways that I do that. There's an organization called Shut Up and Write that was started actually by someone in San Francisco who decided that he just wanted to have a time where he could be with other writers and just write and not feel like he had to show anybody his work or get critiqued or anything like that. He just wanted to commit to time that he could write and do it with others. So because writing is a very solitary
Well, it
thing.
is. I was thinking that seems like very opposite of, I've got one friend and that she's a writer, and she'll just disappear out into the desert for a couple of months, literally. And
it's easy to
she'll
do
come
that,
back,
yeah.
and I can't imagine writing with somebody else because it's yours. It's like, are you going to critique my work?
Right.
That's got to be hard too, right?
Well, yeah, and that's another part of
Sure.
writing. If you're serious and you want to be published and you want others, want feedback from others about your writing, then you get involved in a critique group where you're actually sharing your writing with others, and you're each looking at your different stuff, and then you're commenting and you're giving feedback and you're receiving feedback. The idea being that to improve what you're writing.
Right.
But Shut Up and Write is very different in that it was just about writing. Shutting up and writing, but doing it in a group with others. So, you literally, you can do this virtually. I have a lot of groups that I'm part of that are virtual now, and then others that are in person, where you basically all meet, you spend a little bit of time, everybody gets to talk about what their goals are for the session. And then once you've done that, then you literally shut up. So it's write, and you do it in silence.
Perfect.
And you just write, and then maybe you write for an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And then at the end of that time, you all get back together and you say, okay, so how did everybody do, right? So then you can talk about what you accomplished. And then you're done. And that's it. But the idea is so simple, but it's really very powerful. And there's something magical about writing in a group with other writers.
What a great exercise.
And even though you're not sharing information, but it's just the idea of committing yourself and setting that time aside so that it's okay for you to go ahead and let go of everything else that's going on around you and just focus on your work in progress, on your writing. And then you get to share it with other people. And, being part of Shut Up and Write has actually I've built a lot of friendships
I bet.
through that. And
like-minded friends, hey.
Oh, yeah, and other writers, and then people that are working on other projects, because sometimes people will come, and maybe they're not, writing a novel, but they might be, say, writing code, they're working on software development.
No kidding.
Or they're writing emails because, for their job, their, regular job, and maybe they're taking an hour out of their day to join this group so they can get, a report done. Or maybe they're working on their dissertation.
Right.
So you meet a lot of really interesting people working on different projects. And there's no pressure because you don't have to share anything. You don't have to tell anybody. You don't even have to tell me what you're working on if you don't want to. But, the idea being that if you have a goal you want to accomplish, giving yourself a time limit as well, it can also be very, very inspiring, right? Very
Just
empowering.
being around people that also have a deadline or a goal.
That's right.
So we're all working towards a goal.
Yeah.
I'll be different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And similar goals,
Have you tried to write any books? Have you done any?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I write a lot.
Do you?
Yeah.
Did you ever get anything published?
Not yet.
Not yet? Yeah.
I have one short story that is supposed to be published in a fiction anthology in 2025, in the spring of 2025. So that's out there or waiting out there. And then I have right now I'm working on a novel, so I'm almost done with my revision of the novel that I have.
Oh, wow.
And I write a lot of short stories. I have a lot of short stories that I've been sending out to hopefully find a home, hopefully to be published.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I have other books. I've got novels I've written that are in draft, it's not ready to be published, but it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. And these are like the ones that are kind of sitting in the trunk right now, I like to say.
Right.
And I'll go back to those when I'm done with the current one and try to get those cleaned up enough that I can maybe send it out for publication.
People give me hell for reading 3 books at a time. It's like, how do you do that?
Really?
You're writing 3 books at a time.
Yeah, I love reading multiple books.
I know,
too.
me too. I know where they are. They're just hanging there in midair. I know what's going on in that
Right?
story. They're not going anywhere.
Yeah, and as soon as you pick the one up, you remember. Oh yeah, that's where that
Right.
that ended.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, I might back up a couple of pages. I mean, I can't read 2 spy novels at the same time. I'm getting confused. But I can read one about history and one about
Totally. Oh,
right,
yeah.
Clive Cussler or something.
Gosh, I read 4 or 5 at a time.
Do you really?
Yeah.
Right.
I usually try to do I try to read about writing, some books to help the craft,
Sure.
that about the craft of writing, so to help me, develop my own craft. And then I usually have something on Kindle, I like on my phone.
Oh, sure, right.
So wherever I am, if I need
yet.
a book, I have it right there on my phone. And then I have a hard copy, like something, a paperback or whatever that I read usually at night before I go to bed. I've got, a book that I like to read in the morning. Yeah, I try to read. Yeah, I try to read multiple books at once because that, for me, is the only way I feel like I can actually make a dent in my to-be-read list because I have all these books
stacks
that I want to read. Yeah.
And I interview a lot of people that write books, so I constantly have new books coming in too. So I've got a stack.
Yeah, right. It's hard to. Yeah, so you got to read multiple books so that you can catch up.
Right. So tell me about the ones that you have written. What is it? Is it reality or is it?
Well, let's see. I wrote a science fiction novel.
I guess is the word I'm looking for.
Fiction,
Sorry.
Fiction and nonfiction, quite honestly.
Oh,
so,
cool.
I'll just say too. I'll throw out here another plug for National Novel Writing Month, which we're in that right now. November is National Novel Writing Month, and so for every November there's something called NaNoWriMo, which is the National Novel Writing Month, and the idea is that it's a challenge to write a 50,000 word novel in 30 days, and that happens every November. So I've done that NaNoWriMo for a number of years, and so I now have, I have a science fiction novel that I finished. Again, rough, but I did finish it.
Yeah.
It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Right.
It needs to be cleaned up, but it's a novel. It's a story. I have a contemporary literary novel set in South Italy. About language and the love of language and the love of language. And then I have a it's kind of like it's not quite a memoir, but it's a book of short stories about my time living and working overseas for the U.S. government, 1 year that I spent in northern Iraq, in Erbil in Iraq. So I have that one done. And what else? Oh, I have one too last year. last year for NaNoWriMo, I wrote a book about this one. I didn't quite hit 50,000 words, but it's a thriller about a home invasion of an older couple, home invasion of an older couple that is an older couple that the home invaders should have been afraid of. So. So basically, like a home invasion story kind of turned on its head, where it's the home invaders that end up being like the victims.
You broke into the wrong house.
Exactly. That kind of a story. Yeah. And then I have the current book that I'm working on, which is a horror novel set on a research vessel on the Pacific Ocean.
Wow, you're covering all the bases, huh?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Anywhere we can find these?
No, not yet.
Not yet?
In my trunk, as I like to say. Yeah, not yet. But I hope to be done with my current novel, the horror novel, within probably maybe the mid to the end of next year.
Oh, okay.
To have that finally completed, where I'm ready to actually start querying publishers or agents to try to get it published. Yeah.
That's when we'll get you back on the podcast and
sure
give us the synopsis. Where you at?
Oh, I'd love to talk about that.
Right, once it gets ready to go.
Yeah, it's a fun story. It's kind of it was inspired by the Monterey Bay and the Monterey Bay Institute that works with the aquarium and does MBARI that does the research for the aquarium. And so inspired by the work that they do and inspired by the time I spent living in Norway. So there's some Norwegian sea tales that are kind of weaved into this story, and also based on some my upbringing. So I spent a lot of time around the water in boating. My father was in the Navy, so we did a lot of boating when I was growing up, and some of the things that I learned from him. And it's a pretty important book to me. So I hope.
Sound like you're having way too much fun writing.
Oh man,
you're going all different directions. That's so cool. Just investigating.
Yeah, still investigative. Yeah, investigative work. You got to do some research.
Sure, right.
Get to write about stuff that you love, and I can't think of a better way to spend my time.
Yeah,
I love it.
I'm sorry.
No, I love it. Yeah, I love writing. So
we had a lady come in not too long ago, and she had studied all about the French art revolution in the end of the 1800s.
Oh, wow.
And there's information scattered amongst many, many books. She had to read all of it and get it all together. And then she just wrote a screenplay.
Oh,
Did you ever think about doing something like that? Maybe this is the place, the screenplays.
Well, I've kind of done that.
Kind of done that too?
Yeah, I've kind of done that. Yeah, I with another writer friend, she and I actually, for 2 years now, we've taken one of my short stories and turned it into a short film.
Oh, cool.
For a local film contest. Santa Cruz has every year during Halloween, the Halloween month, right? October.
Like a short film
contest.
Like that, sure.
Yeah. And annual film festival that they do, and there's a contest. So we've won 2 years in a row now. We've taken second place with our short films. Yeah.
My son's an actor, and he also owns construction companies in Michigan. And he was the star in a short film, and it won. He got to walk the red carpet of Michigan, but it was really neat getting all the pictures back, and it was short. It was, but he did a great job in it, and how neat.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
that's a lot of fun.
It's really a lot of competitions on that type of thing.
Oh yeah, all over.
Sure.
All over. Yeah, every community, state, national, international as well.
Right,
yeah,
sure.
Absolutely.
Good way to get recognition, written by, directed by, blah, 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 right? Just keep
that's
on kicking them out there.
That's a lot of it, is that, as a writer, you try to, do something that's going to show, that's going to have you stand out, right?
Right.
I mean, because there's so many people, God bless all the writers, because there's so many of them, and so many trying to break through, trying to get books published, stories published. The idea being that whatever you can do to kind of get your name out there and have some recognition, right? And social media is a lot of that. A lot of writers use social media to try to stand out and collect followers, right? So that you have a group of people that you hope will buy your book or your short story, read your short story when it gets published. Yeah.
Right, sure. What an interesting conversation we've had today. I've learned a ton. Right.
I know. I was trying to think, how is this going to go? Because it's kind of eclectic. There's a lot there, and we've just touched the surface.
Right.
We've just barely broken the surface of what I've done in my career and what I'm doing now. Yeah.
This podcast just goes eclectically. Is that a word? That's the word.
I think so.
Kind of like my brain.
Eclectically, yes. Absolutely.
Anything else that we've missed that you want to talk about, or we've covered the government and?
Gosh, yeah. What did we?
Your writing. And everything.
Writing. Yeah, living and working for the government, State Department. The
rest of it,
counterterrorism
if
stuff.
we tell you, we'll have to kill you.
That's right. Yeah. I've told you.
That's all we can tell you.
I've told you what I can tell you. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming in today. I look forward to you coming in a second time once you get this written and we can scatter.
I'm gonna hold you to it. Yeah.
Right
I'll definitely be in contact
when
I'm closer to actually getting something published out there.
Right on.
Great. Yeah. And I appreciate it. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Wasn't so bad at all.
Not so bad.
All right, guys. Thanks for watching. Love you guys.